All right. Pam Bondi walked into that hearing room thinking it would be another routine oversight session. She had her answers prepared. She had her legal team briefed. She had the confidence of someone who believed the Epstein files were safely buried deep enough that no one in that room could pull them back to the surface. She was wrong, because Thomas Massie had been waiting, not just for this hearing, for months. And what he brought into that room, what he placed on the table in front of the entire country, was the kind of documentation that doesn't disappear when the cameras turn off. One confrontation, one set of documents, one moment where Bondi's careful composure cracked just enough for everyone watching to see what was underneath. And what they saw changed the conversation about the Epstein files completely. Because this wasn't about theories anymore. This was a sitting congressman holding documents, asking a sitting attorney general point blank why the American public still cannot see what's inside those files. And her answer told the room everything it needed to know. Not because of what she said, because of what she refused to say. Let's start with why this moment was inevitable. The Epstein files have been the subject of public demand, legal battles, and congressional pressure for years. When Jeffrey Epstein died in federal custody in 2019, the files documenting his network, his associates, his financial transactions, and the identities of individuals connected to his operation did not disappear. They went into vaults, into sealed court orders, into the hands of an administration that promised transparency and delivered stonewalling. Pam Bondi, as Attorney General, sits directly at the center of that promise. She was one of the officials who publicly committed to releasing information, and then the releases came. Carefully curated, heavily redacted, stripped of exactly the details that the public had been demanding for years. Names missing, transactions obscured, communications summarized instead of reproduced. And Thomas Massie, who has made it his explicit mission to push past the official version of events, had been tracking every gap between what was promised and what was delivered. He walked into that hearing room with a stack of those gaps made visible. The moment the confrontation shifted from procedural to explosive came early. Massie didn't wait. He opened directly, cutting through the standard throat clearing of congressional hearings with a question that had no safe answer. He asked Bondi whether she had personally reviewed the Epstein files that remained unreleased. The room shifted, not dramatically, just that particular quality of silence that descends when everyone understands simultaneously that something real is happening. Bondi's response was practiced. She spoke about ongoing legal review processes, about the complexity of managing sealed records, about institutional obligations. Standard language, the kind of answer that sounds like information while containing none. Massie let her finish, and then he put a document on the screen. The document was an internal record showing the status of specific Epstein-related files within the DOJ's own tracking system. It showed that certain files connected to financial records and communications involving named associates had been classified upward after Bondi took office, not released, not reviewed for release. Reclassified, moved further from public access, not closer. Massie read the relevant section out loud. The hearing room went very quiet. Because reclassification isn't a neutral administrative act, it's a decision. Someone made a choice to take files that were on a potential release track and move them to a higher level of restriction. And that decision happened on Bondi's watch. The question Massie asked next was simple. Did you authorize this? What followed was the moment that every legal analyst and every person watching at home focused on entirely, because Bondi did not say no. She did not say she was unaware. She reached for the middle ground that witnesses reach for when yes is dangerous and no is provably false. She said she would need to review the specific document before commenting on its contents. Massie had anticipated exactly this answer. He had a second document ready. The second document was a DOJ internal memo dated after Bondi's confirmation, referencing the reclassification process and noting that it had been conducted with the knowledge and approval of senior leadership. The memo didn't name Bondi specifically, but it named her office, and it named a time frame that placed her squarely inside the decision-making window. Massie asked again, "Did your office authorize this reclassification?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that the committee chairman visibly shifted in his seat. Bondi's legal counsel leaned toward her. The whispered exchange lasted about 10 seconds, and then she gave an answer that her critics immediately labeled a non-answer. She said the Department of Justice operates according to established classification protocols and that any decisions would have followed those protocols under appropriate legal review. She said she stood behind the department's commitment to transparency. She did not answer the question, and Massie made sure the entire room understood exactly what had just happened. Here's what the political coverage is missing entirely. The significance of this confrontation isn't only what Massie proved in the room, it's what the confrontation forced into the public record. Bondi is now on record under congressional oversight, having been presented with specific documentation about specific reclassification decisions and having declined to directly answer whether her office authorized them. That's not a dramatic moment that fades when the hearing ends. That's a congressional record. That's a response, or a non-response, that investigators and journalists will be working with for years. Every future question about the Epstein files now has to account for this exchange. Every future DOJ statement about transparency has to be measured against Bondi's performance in that room. She didn't confess to anything, but she established a pattern of careful avoidance on specific questions about specific documents at a specific moment when the public was watching. And careful avoidance, when the documents are this specific, tells its own story. The documents Massie brought into that room didn't emerge from a partisan opposition research operation. They came from within the DOJ's own administrative record. That matters. When an official's own department's internal documentation raises the questions he was raising, the answer cannot be institutional deflection. The confrontation made visible something that had been operating in the background. The decision to move those files wasn't a clerical action. It was a policy choice. And policy choices made by confirmed officials are not exempt from congressional scrutiny, no matter how many layers of classification sit on top of them. What happens next is the part that should keep everyone watching. Massie has signaled publicly that this hearing was not a conclusion. It was an opening. He has indicated he intends to subpoena specific documentation related to the reclassification decisions. The documents exist. The reclassification decisions are documented. The questions Massie asked are now in the formal hearing record. And records don't disappear. They accumulate. The next hearing, the next document, the next moment when a congressman holds up a piece of paper and asks a question that cannot be safely answered. That moment is already being prepared. We are not done watching this story. Not even close.